Welcome to my economics channel, where I love discussing the subject, but most importantly, I love to make something fun and interesting to learn. And to that end, I want to discuss today how and why banks work. And by that, we all think we know how banks work, in the sense that banks get some sort of deposits, money or cash, whatever you want to call it, and that money or that cash is either then put into a vault or it stays on the server as your deposit, and then the rest can be made out into loans. However, this is not the entire story, and there are actually competing theories on how and why banks work, and specifically what constrains bank lending. And so the first theory says that loans depend upon deposits coming into the bank first. The second theory states that yes, banks can only make loans when deposits come in, but they multiply up those loans. And then the final competing theory states that loans create deposits, in that banks can create loans first, which create deposits, and then they can look for reserves later. And in fact, that's exactly how banks work. Bank managers don't have to wait around for deposits to come in before issuing loans. If you're a credit-worthy borrower and you're good for the money, they can make a loan for you. They can issue you a loan, which then creates a corresponding deposit. And so, of course, all three theories can't be correct at the same time. And yet, as I'm going to show in this video, there is a way we can rescue this, and we can show how banks actually work, and we can show what constrains bank lending. And so all of this is based on a tweet thread which I made on my Twitter. And without any further ado, let's get into this soothing B-roll and let's get into the video. Let's start off our lending example without a bank. The setup is simple. You have $3, and everyone else in this little economy has $10. The borrower has $0. In the aggregate, we now have $13. But the borrower has a cool business idea he wants to start. In this case, it's selling garum, which is made from fermented fish guts. Sounds absolutely delicious? Well, everyone else also agrees with you, and so there's plenty of demand. You, as the saver, you want a return on your money, and the borrower has a cool idea to expand the pie for everyone and create new experiences. He just needs $3 in order to get going. As there are no banks, you then lend him $3 and demand $1 of interest. There are no credit expansions involved, and the aggregate amount of money in the economy stays the same. The borrower then spends the money to have his building constructed alongside gathering his supplies. The borrower spends the money amongst everyone else who does the work for him. Aggregate amount of money in the economy remains the same. Borrower then makes some sales and actually earns $5, which will net him $1 profit after he pays you back. All of the money from the sales of garum came from everyone else, and the aggregate amount of money stays the same. And yet, what is the net result of all of this? Wealth and growth have increased, and there are now new experiences people can have. Overall happiness has increased. And yet, even though we have a new building and new growth, the amount of money in the economy has stayed the same. It seems that at a minimum, we should have $14 in aggregate in the economy. The $1 profit the borrower made came from everyone else and made them monetarily poorer, even as the range of experiences expanded. Now let's do the same example, but with a bank. Now let's separate out everyone into savers and borrowers, with a bank in the middle. This will make the example easier. The savers have $13, the borrowers have $0, and the savers still want to earn interest. The bank will pay out $1 of interest to the savers. The bank will also charge $2 of interest from the borrowers. That leaves the bank with $1 with which to pay its expenses and then have a profit with the remainder. The savers put all of their money into the bank. The bank can now make loans from these savings. And so we might imagine that the bank's balance sheet looks like this. And yet, why should it look like this? The bank notices not everyone wants or needs to withdraw their money from the bank at the same time. $3 in cash will cover the daily needs of the bank, while $10 can be loaned out. We will assume every loan made pays off. And so the theory which states that a bank can only make loans based on how much cash it has does hold here. And so the loans are then made. However, in due time, $2 of interest is due. How does that show up on the balance sheet? And so what has happened? $2 has come in as income. However, $1 is automatically paid out to the savers outside of the balance sheet / bank. The $1 difference shows up as an increase in cash and in equity. Why would we see an increase in the liability side of the balance sheet? That's because should the bank wind down operations, that $1 is owed to the owner or owners, and hence it's a liability of the bank. And yet, we can do the same example another way. In this example, instead of paying out the $1 outside of the bank, we can just increase everyone's deposits, which people use as money. In both examples, we have growth and we have $14 in deposits, $1 in equity, which is $15 in aggregate. And so we have growth which has occurred because of the borrowers, and we actually have money growth in the economy. And that's exactly what we want. However, it's not as if introducing a balance sheet into the example is somehow magical. Where and how did this $2 come from? It seemed to come from outside the economy. Whereas in the example without the bank, the interest came from within the economy itself, meaning that money was circular and couldn't grow. And so in that sense, for this example, I have cheated. And yet, we can rescue this example. In this quote-unquote cheating example, additional money showed up after growth occurred. And yet, what if we expanded the money supply before the borrowers got to work? We can now skip a step. Loans now create deposits. And so, we can imagine the following balance sheet. And yet, what is going on here? The bank notices that few people withdraw their money from the bank, and instead, when they make payments, they simply make their payments on the balance sheet, and so no cash has to actually change hands. And so on the bank's balance sheet, all it has to do is debit one person and credit another person, and a payment is done. The $3 in cash remains an asset, just in case. And so when a new entrepreneur comes along and wants a loan, the bank can still create it for him. And that is now $2 additional in the economy, which is credit. It is not backed by the original money or deposits. In that sense, you could say that the cash has been multiplied up into a new loan / deposit combo. The money supply has expanded before any new activity has actually occurred. I'd argue that this is one of the magical features of banks, in that they are holding the future expansion of the economy on their balance sheet, which shows up as an aggregate increase in the supply of credit. This is new purchasing power that all can enjoy. You will note that before the expansion of this new credit, that the bank's operations can be unwound and everyone can get their money back if all the loans are repaid. A reminder of the balance sheet as follows. And so A represents the original money and is what you might call, quote, ground zero for the economy. If the bank winds down operations, A can be unwound and everyone gets their money back. Aggregate amount of money in the economy remains the same. And yet, B is unbacked and cannot be paid out if the bank unwinds its balance sheet. B is purchasing power so long as the bank remains in operation. The turning wheel has started and it's impossible to get off without causing issues. Should the bank shut down, we now have a loss of aggregate money in the economy. We have a contraction. Those newly created deposits only have purchasing power as long as the bank remains in business, only as long as the economy continues to chug along and grow. And what is the bank in the business of? Creating new loans, destroying credit when loans are repaid, and charging and paying out interest. How does it do this? Find new opportunities in the economy, create new credit by expanding the money supply, and cause growth. And it then takes a slice of that new growth as an interest payment, and hence creates a profit for itself so it can remain in business. And so thinking back to the original balance sheet, Where does the $2 interest payment for the original $10 of loans that were created come from? It in fact comes from the new $2 deposit that was created. The new entrepreneur spends that money into the economy in the course of starting their new business. New growth will be created, and the bank has created new credit in advance of that. And that money is spent into the economy, and the bank credits and debits as required, and eventually that $2 can find its way to the original borrowers, who have now earned the $2 required to pay back the interest. But as the new loans are paid back, this new credit is destroyed. And so how will the interest for the new $2 loan get repaid? New loans, of course. And this is a cycle and dance that must continue if the bank is to remain in business, but more importantly, for growth to occur. And so banks can create loans if there are savers in the economy, but can also create loans, quote, out of thin air. Loans create deposits and new purchasing power. So what constrains bank lending? Let's introduce a central bank. I put an asterisk in to show that in the aggregate, the reserves, which are a liability of the central bank, are the reserves that banks use as an asset. It's a closed system that the central bank controls, and for banks to issue credit, they must be part of this system. The central bank can expand both sides of its balance sheet as required, as QE has showed us, and it can contract its balance sheet, as QT is showing. It also controls the price of reserves. Banks can lend reserves back to the central bank and earn a low interest rate. Banks can also borrow reserves from the central bank at a high rate. This creates a corridor, a system most banks had before QE swelled balance sheets. Let's say it's 1 and 3%. But banks can borrow from one another. 2% is better for a bank to earn lending its reserves to another bank, and that 2% is also a cheaper rate for another bank to borrow reserves at. And so the corridor system controls banks. And this middle rate is how we get the overnight rate of interest or the federal funds rate. And thus, banks rarely need to lend to the central bank to earn interest, nor do they need to borrow from the central bank. They all do that in the interbank market. Every day, deficit banks borrow from surplus banks in order to ensure they settle their accounts. And yet, will there always be a surplus bank to borrow from? What is a surplus bank? It's a bank that has received deposits/payments over and above its needs throughout the day. And the deficit bank has originated loans but hasn't received sufficient deposits/payments. This is surprisingly and quietly profound. The deficit bank can originate a loan only because a surplus bank has surplus that can, quote, cover that loan. Loans create deposits, and yet it can only be created because there are enough aggregate savings already in the economy. What if there are no surplus banks? The deficit bank has to borrow from the central bank. Expensive. But the central bank wants to prevent this and has control over those administrative rates. In a scenario where there are no surplus banks, interest rates might be too low. The central bank then raises its administrative rates, and hence the overnight interest rate for the economy also rises. This raises borrowing costs, and indeed some loans won't be created, and the credit supply won't be expanded. Of course, reserves aren't resources in and of themselves, and it's a closed system. But those reserves put a price on money, and ideally it's the best balance that allows just enough credit growth in the economy. So surplus banks exist because money/cash is deposited into these banks, and these are part of aggregate savings. Part of the aggregate savings are not needed for this bank and can be lent to a deficit bank that didn't receive enough money/cash. And so banks can only lend and create new credit if there are enough savings already in the economy. They can then effectively multiply these up into new loans, and indeed banks originate loans that create new deposits and hence increase the credit supply. An individual bank can originate a new loan if it seems a borrower is creditworthy, as it knows it can find reserves later, if it trusts the central bank's prices, but this is only possible because there already exist enough aggregate savings in the economy. And in this manner, we've now rescued all three competing theories about how banks lend and ultimately what constrains their lending. And so that's the end of this video. This video is a bit of a speed run, as you might have noticed. And in fact, I've made a much longer video, actually my previous video, which I'll link to down below, which is actually 55 minutes and goes into much more detail, and it's a bit slower paced. However, if you want more detail, a bit more information, that's down below. You can watch that video. However, if you have any questions about this video, don't hesitate to ask below and I'll do my best to answer, or at the very least, I'll collect the questions and I'll answer them in a separate video. And if you wouldn't mind subscribing and sharing my videos so I can reach a wider audience and eventually make money from this channel, which would be amazing for me and, in a third-hand sense, amazing for you as well. But that's the end of my video. Thank you for watching all the way through to the end, and I'll see you guys next time.